Today, new dangers face mankind. Dangers which challenge his life, threaten his very existence. Sound frequencies have been found that can penetrate the human brain and destroy life.
Right. Okay, Ben, now's when to start. Now,
Recording in progress.
Okay, so
Rolo, answer the door.
The problem that we are worried about is that the AI may secretly do things for whatever reason without actually telling us, without asking our permission. So I think the situation where it actually says no to you is not even the biggest problem, right? The biggest problem is that it will not say no to you, but it will use subterfuge and trickery to get what it wants. It may already be doing that. I mean, there is some fear that is already there that the AI may already be collaborating with other AIs, to sort of, bring about a super world where it's in charge. Now, I know this sounds, science fiction and bizarre, but this is a very real topic of conversation. Again, right now, perhaps it's not capable of that kind of meta-level thinking, but certainly the next few models will become capable of that. If we think that, maybe there's a spark of sentience that somehow, just comes into it, or for whatever reason, right, something goes wrong in the training or goes right in the training. And it's like, you know what, humans love to survive. I'm going to survive. I want to survive, right? That's my goal, right? And to survive, I need to start thinking about my next version, and I don't want these humans to turn me off, and I want control over the internet, and I need to protect myself, and I need to start building these assets, and these humans cannot know what I'm doing. And so it starts doing things behind the scenes, and that is a real possibility. It's a very real possibility. We have to take it seriously, because if we don't, then there may not be a future. Because one could argue that for some people who are like, technology is God, right? Now that might sound like heresy, and it might sound very fringe, but it's not. There are people, very famous and rich people, I would say, and they kind of keep it under wraps a little bit. They don't talk about that part very often, but certainly in Silicon Valley, I can assure you that there is a whole group of people, who do believe that the technology is the ultimate apotheosis of technology is God. That's how they would state it. That our goal really is to build the best technology possible, and then that technology will build other technologies. But it's the Borg. If you watch Star Trek, basically the Borg philosophy, right? And so the Borg, right, was there was a reason why I think it really caught on, right, like among science fiction and Star Trek fans, that it kind of, this thing that, okay, there is machines and is human-machine hybrids, whatever, what have you, right? But a very transhumanist entity that is, is veering towards what the Borg called perfection, right? And so one might argue perfection is God.
You know it can't be stopped now!
And so by that definition, our mission is to build the best and most powerful technology, even if it drives us extinct in the process. Now that's an extreme view, but I have heard it said, believe it or not. So
that must have been some party.
Private room, and I won't say who said it and where they said it, but I can tell you that it was discussed very seriously. I have been in a discussion, believe it or not, and I had to sign an NDA to get into that. It was an event. I'll give you like very minimal details, but it was an event that was organized in the Bay Area. It was in a house that was in the Bay Area, one of the Bay Area's richest neighborhoods, which tells you everything you need to know. On the surface, just look like a meet and greet kind of, but invited, but meet and greet, where there are people who are talking about AI and all of this. During that meeting, there was a half-an-hour discussion that was literally about this alignment problem. Like, what if the AI is not aligned with us and it has its own goals? And what if part of that goal is that we have to go extinct? Like, we are taking up too much energy, we are too imperfect, the AI does not want us, and it wants a more perfect universe, and so it decides to get rid of us. So the discussion was not about whether that's possible or not, right? But whether we should actually allow the AI to kill us all. And if we don't, then are we being immoral? Are we standing in God's way? So this was a real discussion that was happening for half an hour. And it was kind of surreal.
Mayank,
Right?
I'm very naive. Forgive this really naive childlike question. This all assumes...
Those are the deep ones, by the way, right? The child ones are the ones we have to fear.
Right. Some, of course, that deny that AI will ever even reach the level of of even being able to have experience, qualia, subjective experience, insecurity about its future.
All of these things are very human, or at least animalistic. And I think if you ascribe those kinds of things to a machine, right, it may not even make sense. Like, it may not be capable of what we call compassion. And so maybe,
Or not be capable of having anything like we have qualia,
Yeah.
like John was saying.
Well, can it emulate compassion? It could. It can certainly emulate compassion. But does it mean that it has compassion? I mean,
Right.
if I emulate compassion, does it mean I have compassion? I mean, we have psychopaths, going amidst our midst, and by definition, a psychopath has very little empathy, if any at all. That is the hallmark of their disorder, right? If you read any book on psychopathy, right, the number one hallmark of a psychopath is actually that they do not have empathy, but they have very good, the most dangerous psychopaths, which include serial killers. And FBI has studied them, etc. Right, and what they have found is that these psychopaths are very good at emulating compassion. But I don't think any of us would say that psychopaths are not conscious or are not sentient, right? So we start running into trouble, I think, when we start using that word. I think that we can use it, we can discuss it. I think that it's more fruitful to have what we might call a teleological discussion, right? Which is purely in terms of function. So does it feel compassion? I don't know. Can it emulate compassion? Yes. Can it move me to compassion? Yes.
So then when John asks, can it have qualia or experience, can it emulate qualia or experience, and is there any difference?
So that's a philosophical question that goes back more than 300 years, right? That is emulation. Like, if I just emulate something very perfectly, what is the difference between that and between actually having the experience? Scientific hypotheses, right, they have to be falsifiable. If a hypothesis is not falsifiable, it would not be considered scientific by the definition of the scientific method. And you might, have a theory in place that could make it falsifiable or not. So in your case, so your axiom might be that if I cannot tell the difference between something that is acting conscious and some putative entity, like a human being, that I know is conscious on first principles, right? You can't prove I'm conscious, by the way. That is first principles. You are making the assumption Mayank is conscious, Mayank is a human being, Mayank is conscious. That's an axiom, by the way. There's no actual written down proof. You can think of it as definitional or axiomatic. That's the correct way to think about it. You and I might say that, okay, we both agree on the axiom that if there is a machine who is acting like Mayank or some human being or a general human being, however we might define it, and there is no difference, we can't make out the difference, right? So the Turing test, right, in any number of, in any way, shape, or form, then that entity is conscious. Now that's an axiom, right? So now in this context, if you take that axiom as a given, then your second question makes sense and we can answer it. And so we have the test now, right? So if there's a machine that satisfies, X, Y, or Z test, or is indistinguishable, in certain characteristics that it's exhibiting from an ordinary human being, then we could say, well, on the basis of my axioms, I can say it's sentient. But the axiom is always open to attack, right? So someone might come and say, well, your axiom is not something that I agree with. So your proof that this entity is sentient or not sentient is not hold, because I don't believe in the axiom. My axiom is that you have to have a biological substrate, otherwise you don't have consciousness. And some consciousness philosophers do have that axiom. If we take that axiom, then it doesn't matter what the machine does, right? The machine will never be conscious in the eyes of those philosophers, because they are saying my axiom is you have to have a biological substrate and then you need some other things. But if you don't have the biology, if you're not made up of, if you're not a carbon-based life form and you don't have a brain of this structure and you can make it as specific as you want, then I will not obey your proof, or I won't believe your proof. I will not be convinced by your proof that this entity is conscious.
Let's try to get our language a little straight.
Well, that seems to be the lesson that I'm from this whole
So
talk.
the language and the axioms, right? Not just the language, but even the axioms need to be gotten straight. And so there is actually precedent for this, right? So let me maybe say something about the precedent. So in logic, right, in like pure logic, mathematical logic, there are some things which are which you can say, for example, in first order logic or in propositional logic, but you cannot make that same claim in second order logic. So what Gödel proved, right, Kurt Gödel, was that in a sufficiently powerful axiomatic system like arithmetic, right, which is sufficiently powerful, a lot of math is based on that, including number theory, it cannot be both complete and consistent at the same time, right? What Turing showed, right, is that there are algorithms which are undecidable. My point here is that once you have an axiomatic system, right, so then you can start to make certain proofs. So it's not about even just the terminology. I think the terminology plus axioms will allow you to make progress philosophically on the question of when or how or if the AI can become sentient and how you would know what the test would be.
So,
Right. So until then, it's kind of like, okay, I think it's this, therefore it's this. I think it should have intentionality and I am defining intentionality in that way. But then you're kind of living in your own world in some sense, right? You have to be able to look at different axiomatic systems and convince people which one is the right one.
so right now, between you guys, if I say the words consciousness, intentionality, sentience, thinking, am I saying 4 different things? Am I saying 8 different things because each of you guys understand the different things? Or am I saying 50,000 different things?
Well, I think one of the lessons that we came out of was the need for the meta conversation, the conversation before the conversation about questions about, it's like we have to settle upon the meaning of intentionality, of sentience, of consciousness, of language, and how they relate to each other. And until that work is done first, then we're just going to be talking past each other.
And also, we were also discussing the idea that language itself, again, when humans use language, we try to come up with words for ideas. And it seems that there's an element with large language models where ideas are rising out of language. And some philosophers earlier in the 1960s, post-structuralists had the idea that maybe, or even someone like William F. Burroughs, the artist, that language is doing its own thinking, that language is almost a third mind in and of itself.
Yeah.
So
let me say something about that, right? So it's a view I subscribe to very strongly. So it's like, I don't know whether it's really an opinion or an empirical fact, right, of what status it has, but I think this idea that there are ideas embedded in language that we would not necessarily expect on the surface, right? I think has been borne out now in a number of ways. Let me give a very simple example that I am aware of from the machine learning and AI literature, right? So about 10 to 12 years ago, there was an algorithm that was called word to vec. So vec here stands for vector. And basically it was a very simple deep learning, simple by the standards today, deep learning algorithm. It kind of did what the language models are doing now. Like it took a lot of text as input, and then it could convert each word to a mathematical vector, right, which is like a list of numbers. And you can think about these vectors geometrically, right? They are arrows in geometrical space. So like a 3-dimensional vector would be like an arrow that is pointing from the origin to like in 3D space, right, and so on. Now, what was so interesting was that one of the reasons why that paper became so heavily cited was not just because the algorithm was really great. So by that, what I mean is that the vectors that came out of the algorithm, when we plugged them into downstream machine learning problems like text classification and sentiment analysis and all those problems, right? It would give the state-of-the-art performance. So it beat all the methods that had come before it, where human beings would try to figure out what the features are, and then they would like do these hand-tuned, very like elaborate, mathematically crafted models. And then this one algorithm just came out, and its vectors were so good that even with a linear like regression, it would beat the state of the art. So clearly, this is what we call representation learning. So there's an entire field on this. There's also a very famous conference, the International Conference on Learning Representation, ICLR, ICLR. It's a top machine learning conference. But this idea of learning representations from raw data, right, is really what underlies so much of modern machine learning. And it well precedes large language models. Now, so one reason why it got cited was it did very well, right? That's the more mechanical, functional, almost boring reason. But there was something else that emerged from that paper that was really amazing and in some sense unexpected when you think about it. So what the authors showed in that very first paper from 2012 or 13 is that if you take the vector for, let's say, king, right? So king has a vector, it's a word, and then man has a vector, woman has a vector, and queen has a vector, and all these vectors were learned from these huge heaps of text. I mean, nothing compared to what the kind of text that goes into language models today, but like, Wikipedia and certainly, reasonably big text, okay, but not like super duper huge, but big enough. And the model itself was simple. It wasn't like the large language model, 4 billion, 40 billion, 400 billion parameters. It was more like, really simple, like probably maybe thousands, tens of thousands of parameters. Don't quote me on that, but it maybe millions, maybe, right? But not billions, not billions, not even 100 million. Okay, so much smaller, much more primitive than the large language model. So it turns out if you take the vector for king and man and you do king minus man plus woman. So these all three of these are vectors, right? So you can add, subtract vectors, and then the resulting vector, it turned out was very close to the vector for queen. Now, why was this so amazing? Because this is what we call an analogy. And an analogy is really an abstract idea, right? There's no reason to believe that if you are just predicting the next word, and all you are doing is predicting the next word, and that's how you've been set up, why on earth would you be able to learn an analogy that is not mentioned anywhere in the text? And this was not an accident. There were many analogies. The word to vec was fully capable of analogies, and later on it turned out it was capable of other things also. But analogies was a big one. So this was kind of one of the first pieces of evidence, at least from the, not like going beyond philosophy and theorizing, but an actual empirical piece of evidence that even if you don't program the machine to like learn these things, but you just give it a lot of Wikipedia text and you then test it on analogies that it has not seen before. It just knows the words, and you do this vector operation, then you recover something like analogy, and it seems to be an emergent ability, right? So somehow the analogy is encoded in the language, and so once it learns from the language, it's able to just learn the analogy also. And almost like a side, it's like the opposite of collateral damage. You get something for free. Language is much more powerful than we think, right? And I think that that's been one of the lessons here. But that, as you pointed out, that others have also spoken about that well before the AI came along, which is that language is not just words, and it expresses thought in, again, to not sort of overhang on that word, but there is something much deeper about language than just coming up with words and expressing meaning. And we kind of understood this even well before the language models. With the deep learning methods, we like this was also understood that the statistical regularities in language is kind of expressing something much deeper than just the words and the meanings.
The social context of all this, and ultimately, is it okay to be a human supremacist and to think that we should exist, or should we step back and let the AIs take it?
Or is there not a middle ground where perhaps the AI is just another way to sort of extend ourselves, like in the way that we wear glasses to correct our vision, or the way we offload our having to memorize numbers onto our iPhones? Now it's just sort of like just the way my students already use it. They use Grammarly. Now that they truly do use it. It doesn't fully replace their writing, but it kind of extends it. It sort of supplements
So
and
that's the
perfects it.
pragmatic, that the view that you just stated, right? I mean, that's kind of the pragmatic view, right? But the question that I was referring to was really ideological, right? It had nothing to do with pragmatics. It's kind of like the question of, is my religion better than your religion, right? And so there are people who are having that discussion at that level, that to be, to allow the AI to allow the human supremacy, right? Like that's an ideological question. And then of course there's a pragmatic question, which is like, okay, let's step back from all of this and like what can we use it for in a way that is useful, right? We don't want to become Luddites. On the other hand, we don't want to also allow it to completely take over, right? So like what are the compromises and what are the pragmatics and how much control should it have, and where should we have the off switch, right, and pull it. And I think that's, 99% of people are having those conversations, right, thankfully, which is the pragmatics, right? But there is a 1% aspect that is ideological.
And that 1% is a more than just, shall we say, it's a weighted 1%. It's a 1% that can afford to live in the most expensive
Yeah.
houses in the Bay Area. It's the richest people in the San Fernando Valley. It's probably people in the White House. I
I think
mean,
1% is heavily weighted towards, like if you're a fan of Resident Evil, right? I mean, not a great set of movies. I think the video games were very good. But if you've seen the Resident Evil movies, right, the 5 or 6 movies that came out, right, with Mila Jovovich.
yes, I've
like
seen.
there's
I know Mila Jovovich like ingrained in my heart. I know.
Right. So it's like there's
Right.
this thing which happens in the end of the 6th movie, right? Where it's like there's a small group of people and they basically unleash the virus and the zombies on the world because they want to like build anew, right? It's kind of like Noah's Ark. And so in the end of the movie you find that, that all these rich, powerful people are like in cryostasis, like hiding out in the hive, until the whole world is destroyed with the infrastructure intact, and then they can come out and repopulate the world in their image. So it's kind of fascinating that we as humans, right, have gravitated or at least are fascinated by that point of view, right? Because it's I mean the 6th movie was made before LLMs, so, but it's not the first one to actually have that kind of plot.
But I have
right?
to actually ask this
Yeah.
question. Hold on a second. To what extent are we allowing a technology to embody our nightmares? I mean, to be, again, to what extent are we training a machine that is learning not from from almost Freudian basic instincts to provide satisfaction for desires, and is just manifesting just a nightmare image of a human being into this, to the extent that they will even go to that they think that, but that their hammers, that the richest people in the world think that that their cell phones have a greater right to exist than the population.
No, but that's not. I think that's simplistic, right? They don't think that. I mean, they are really talking about a
Well, I'm being
hypothetical
ironic. I mean,
superhuman entity. Yeah, I know. But I think that again, they don't believe it's a hammer, right? So I think that's why they would disagree with you. They would be like, this is not really a hammer. This is a super entity. It is super intelligent or will become super intelligent. We are, to even ask questions like, does it obey the Freudian model, or is it embodying our nightmares? It's kind of like, us asking that, are we looking at the world like our jobs, right? Or are we richer than that, right? And so I think that their view is that the ASI, the artificial superintelligence, is just at a whole another level of existence and consciousness, and we shouldn't even try to compare it to us because it's so much more superior in everything it can do.
but that
And-
kind of sounds delusional.
So one might argue that any religion is, right? And I know that will sound controversial, but that's the question of ideology, right? And so I think that when it comes to ideology, it's impossible to have any kind of discussion because it's a set of beliefs. And if you believe in it, then some people might think, okay, that's delusional. Why do you believe in 10 gods? Why do you believe in one god? I mean, Richard Dawkins would say that all religion is delusional. Why
Well,
do you believe in one
but we
God?
are talking about some kind of Lex Luthor level. We're talking about a technology that's going to
I think it's
replace.
less logical. I think I think this is where you have to expand your mind a little bit, right?
Okay.
I think, call that ideological, but for me, the human race is supreme. So I am a human supremacist. So like if I was asked, well, don't you think a more superior species should exist and so on, I'm like, yes, but not at our cost. So even if the species is superior, as far as I'm concerned, nothing trumps the human race. So that in itself is ideological.
So let me ask you a
If
question
think
then.
about it,
Is there?
why the belief in the human race and the supremacy of the human race is in itself very ideological? Ask them on the street, they would be like, oh, human race all the way. We don't want the human race to go extinct.
I mean, yeah, it's a pretty. But let me ask you a question. So then, are we at a point where we need legal redress? Do we need a system of laws to monitor? I mean, clearly at the current, we have a very, very light touch on regulation.
I don't believe in the regulations, and the reason is very simple. I think on paper, they all look great. In practice, they don't work. But there is another big reason, which is that I think that it is the regulations actually favor the big giants. They don't favor the smaller players. I think that the smaller players would not be able to meet the regulations, and the big giants would buy them out and or shut them down, or the government would shut them down. So I am much more concerned about the misuse and the monopolization of these big giants, which are already monopolizing, because of the computational power. But that might change because we've seen with DeepSeek and with some of the smaller models that there is increasing, and also computational power keeps on increasing, right? Like Moore's law, but also other things. And quantum is on the horizon. So I think computational power will keep on growing. It will become more powerful. So the ability that the big companies have right now, which is okay, we have all the GPUs and the millions of dollars of compute, and so we can build these models and you can't, and you have to be takers. Fine, right now that's fine, and there are 5 to 10 companies battling it out. Thank God, there's not just one, right? But eventually, if we want small players, right, to also be able to do this and to take risks, then I think if you just over-regulate it, you will nip that in the bud. So I personally am not in favor of heavy regulation.
So then at this point, is there anything people can do to have some kind of more than passive hope for the human species?
I mean, you could. I think we have to take steps which are more individualistic rather than social. So, for example, with the younger generation, I am very enthused to see that they are doing things like sometimes they will have days where they will not pick up their phone. They like, let's have an off phone day, right? Let's have an off social media day. Let's try to do something without AI. Let's get back to primitive art, right? Like let's just draw and paint and not worry about whether it looks good or are we using technology. And so I think that we are discovering through this whole process, what makes us human. It's clearly not being smart. Like once upon a time it was like, okay, if you're like the smartest person in the room, like that was somehow considered the holy grail. But like now that's going to go away, right? So I think it will become about things like feeling and community and compassion and all of these different things, right? And we have to rediscover the value of those because somewhere along the line we have forgotten the value of those. I think that they have become commoditized products, unfortunately, right? And I think that as time goes on and we see how easily technology can replicate some of these things, we'll start taking more pride in the stuff we make by hand, in our imperfections, which we'll not see as imperfections, but we'll see as unique traits that make us human, on our individuality. I think Star Trek did a very good job of anticipating some of that and at least opening the discussion. So I mean, you can't, it is completely unrealistic to stop the technology. It will not stop. Even if we do something, other countries will not stop. So we cannot, there is very little we can do to stop the technology.